Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Makone Maja. Let's get into the news of today. And the first thing is a bit of good news. There has been at least a temporary victory in the battle against the National Health Insurance. National Health Insurance is this, for those who don't know, it was an act passed by Parliament and signed into law just before the 2024 election, which essentially envisions eventually abolishing the vast majority of private health insurance products and instead having almost all medical spending in the country determined by a single government health insurance scheme, which will allocate money in the medical system. Essentially, the creation of an SOE that will have the sole purpose of spending money. It also has various other effects, essentially centralizing a lot of government control over the healthcare system, kind of at the top. Well, it has been facing numerous court challenges from a variety of groups, including the Western Cape government, including a variety of health insurers, medical professionals, etc., and facing the significant pushback and uncertainty about the act's legality. President Cyril Ramaphosa has, in consultation with Minister Aaron Motsoaledi from the Health Department, said that they will delay the proclamation of any sections of the National Health Insurance Act until the Constitutional Court has handed down judgments and challenges, which are due to be heard somewhere in early May. Government did say that it was committed to the national health insurance and will work within the requirements of the law and judicial process to ensure that there is no undue delay. But Makone, this seems to me to be a very significant setback to the law and suggests to me that it really is on the back foot when it comes to its implementation. Do you think government is going to try and push through NHI at some point, or is this just going to sit on the back burner, do you think?
I think there will still be a push. The article mentions that the court hearings regarding the NHI will be held in early May, I believe, the first week of May. But what this story tells me is it demonstrates that the public hearings that go into laws that are passed, when laws are passed, there are public hearings that are held for the public to make submissions for or against the policy, that it costs the government to not take those hearings seriously, because the president is acknowledging that the challenge to the NHI that will be heard later in May is regarding issues that were raised during the hearings themselves, procedural issues regarding whether the hearings were actually substantive. The IRR made its own submission, and basically on the same basis. So we submitted procedural reasons why the NHI should not be passed, including that the public hearings were basically a campaigning action by the ANC. It appeared from these hearings, which the IRR mentions in its submission, according to people like Gwarube, who was at the time the shadow health minister of the DA, and individuals from Section 27 who attended these hearings, that people had been bussed in, ANC supporters had been bussed in to just simply express support for the NHI, that these were people dressed in ANC regalia. And so it didn't seem like opposition to the NHI would actually be given a fair hearing at these public summits. And so because the government was determined when these hearings were being held to bulldoze through them and carry on tabling the NHI anyway, regardless of whatever opposition was received, it now has to go through the court, right, to actually weigh and assess whether the NHI is constitutional. But if it had heeded those submissions, which we've come to learn that the government don't, they treat them peripherally, they treat them as a box-ticking exercise. If it had actually taken those processes, those public hearing processes seriously, and when it tables laws and legislation, it would have averted this. And so we just have a government that wastes money on litigating when it could have avoided this by actually taking those processes seriously. And this is the same with the NHI. When the president in October of 2025 last year, with the Expropriation Act, excuse me, when he came out and said, applied for the court to amend elements of the Expropriation Act for fear that they would be in error because they were vague, and vagueness is a principle that must be considered when laws are made. When he came out with that request for the courts to amend the wording of the act, that is another one of those cases that could have been avoided if public hearings were actually considered when laws are drafted in South Africa. Because again, the IR made the submission about the Expropriation Act, warning about that particular vagueness of when people who face expropriation, candidates of expropriation, may approach the court. But again, the government simply does not take those processes seriously because it is determined to make laws regardless of what the public has to say about those laws.
Yeah, I think we're seeing sort of government run up in some regards. It's sort of its ideology is preventing it from being able to implement almost this ideology in the sense that it's sort of so maniacally focused on no compromise, no climb down, no adjustment, that it, instead of getting half a loaf, it gets nothing, which in this case I think is a good thing for the country, but it's also, I think, something that does continuously run into trouble. And of course now the ANC, when it passed the NHI, it had a majority in parliament, no longer has that majority. So if this ends up all going down in flames, they're going to have to make a deal with someone in order to get some new version of it passed through parliament. So I think they want to avoid that at all costs, it going anywhere near there. But this is, I think, a very good thing. NHI, I think, if implemented, would be disastrous. One of the things that keeps our middle class in the country not fleeing overseas is the fact that we have a pretty good private medical health system and health insurance system. It's got its problems, but it's not too bad. If that was destroyed instead of expanded, which is what government should instead be aiming to do, we would see probably, I think, some real flight to the tax base. At which point the project of ever getting out of South Africa's current situation will become much more distant. So I'm very happy about this news. Obviously, until the president has said that the law will not be implemented and Parliament's repealed it and it's thrown into the wood chipper, it's still going to be a living concern. It's still going to be causing problems. It's still going to be lurking there in the background, halting proper planning in the healthcare department, right? Because you're always going to have to at least pay some sort of lip service to NHI and consider it in your planning. But for me, this is a positive development. Any final thoughts on that?
The NHI has been a deep source of frustration for me as well. I think the president writes in the announcement about their commitment to providing healthcare, quality healthcare, and that this is a constitutional right, but they failed on even providing the basics. Why do we still have so much corruption in our healthcare system? Why do we have so much wasteful expenditure when if healthcare is such an important right in South Africa? Why has there been no serious reviewing of healthcare expenditure to ensure that every single rand is committed to improving the lives of people who do go to, public hospitals? We're not seeing a government that seriously wants to improve health outcomes by improving the state of healthcare services, but we are seeing a government that is dedicated to redistributing those health outcomes so that instead of some having better outcomes than others, we all just generally have bad ones, right? And so if there was a commitment to improving healthcare services, we would see things like service providers who have corruption allegations being investigated, being prosecuted, being removed from the system. We would see the amount of money that the government spends paying for for liability claims because people received terrible services from healthcare institutions. We'd see those amounts going down because fewer and fewer people would be getting injured at public hospitals. We would see those sort of improvements. We would see more hospitals, more ambulances being operational. But because their commitment is not truly to improving healthcare services, we're seeing everything but.
You know, the Tembisa hospital case, which was such an important example of exactly kind of the problems we're talking about here. The only reason that really came to light in the way it did was because there were some mainstream media journalists who really doggedly pursued that one and investigated it and looked into it after the murder of Babita Deokran, and there were whistleblowers who came forward, and it was based on that it eventually got into the hands of the Special Investigative Unit, where it is now finally having some sort of legal action, although not nearly enough being done to kind of remedy that. How many other hospitals around the country and parts of our health department are similarly maladministered or corruptly administered? We don't really know. We know that it's probably quite a lot, but until the system sort of works on a basic level, you can't just, and I've seen the argument made by, I think it was by Dr. Nicholas Crisp from the health department, although I apologize for putting words in his mouth, but essentially saying that, no, you see, NHI will actually solve all these problems because, you know, they're all, the decisions on spending the money will be centralized. Well, I have a portfolio of bridges to sell you. If that is indeed your your belief, I think that is either painfully naive or cynical, quite frankly, about what would happen if NHI was created. There's not a single part of the government that is not tainted by capture cronyism and major corruption, and sort of centralizing it all in NHI is not going to just magically protect it from those things. Okay, let us move on. The Madlanga Commission has been ongoing, and we haven't talked about it that much. There's so many sort of little intimate details about who is doing what. Personally, I have been a little bit slacking on my keeping up to date with the Madlanga Commission. I'm hoping more to kind of wait for the end to sort of work out what the most important parts are. But there are several things that emerge. One of them is that, what is he accused of? Attempted murder, I think he's currently in prison for. And alleged criminal mastermind Musmuzi Kat Matlala was apparently very well connected into the senior ranks of the South African Police Service. The commission heard that he seemed to have a relatively warm relationship and close relationship with Shadrach Sabir, who's a senior official in the police, through a fixer, a sort of middleman who would relay messages from one to the other. It seems as though he was a sort of private guest at one point of Sabir was a private guest of Matlala at some point. Also, apparently, one of the deputy police generals, General Hilda Sentumule, was said to have had a Brazilian butt lift surgery paid for her by Kat Matlala, which in the pre-show discussion, let me just tell you, it was very difficult to get through that sentence without falling apart with laughter. And just generally, it looks like Kat Matlala was extremely well connected to every single, well, not every single, but a huge chunk of the senior leadership of the South African Police Service. Makone, you had so much fire in you. Let's see if we can recapture that when we're talking about this before the show. What are your thoughts on this story?
Yeah, it's disappointing to find that Kat Matlala is in jail, not because of any of these allegations, but because the separate civil case where he alleged to have tried to kill an ex-girlfriend. But I've tried to keep up with the commission. I think it's just an overwhelming amount of evidence. I mean, it streams almost daily, and you have 8 to 9 hours of just information about how corrupt elements of our judiciary system is. And what's emerged, particularly from General Sibia's testimony, is to demonstrate and to further link higher ups in police management to Kat Matlala and to demonstrate how they've possibly benefited financially from him, either buying them things like General
Sorry,
Sintumule, who it is alleged.
sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to mention, of course, that Mklala also had 300 million rands worth of tenders from the police while he was connected to all of these guys, while also being alleged to be connected to all of these sort of criminal elements. Not great, Bob.
No, it seems that he emerges at every one of these important key choke points within the police tender system, because he did have a tender that was awarded to him, his medical company that I think administers medical treatment and fitness treatments, fitness tests to the police. And then he was in line to receive a 360 million rand contract that was since cancelled after these allegations emerged. But back to General Sibiya, is to demonstrate how connected Kat Matlala is to all these important people in the police who can further his career as a tenderpreneur within the police, right? You have General Sibiya coming in with a testimony that's 90 pages long. 17 of those pages are dedicated to his CV alone. So to reminding us of how important and how well accomplished he is. He dedicates, according to Commissioner Kumalo, who was reading, obviously has the bundle of General Sibiya's testimony, only dedicates 2 paragraphs to dealing with one of the most contentious elements of his testimony, which is about Kat Matlala. All the other times he testifies about Madlanga is when he responds to testimonies of other people who've already appeared before the commission to clear his name. It's disgraceful. What use are those 17 pages worth of a CV if we're not able to see that you're an ethical person as a deputy national commissioner, as a top 2 cop in this country? What use is that long CV if we're not able to see integrity in how you carry yourself in the police, if it is alleged that you have such close relationships with the most notorious people? We heard in the ad hoc committee, Glenys Breitenbach, MP Glenys Breitenbach, read Kat Matlala's rap sheet, which has some convictions. Certainly a lot of them he managed to escape and evade, but they did manage to secure some convictions. He's also been tied to the murder of Babita Diokra and the corruption that's happened at the Tembisa Hospital as one of the 5 masterminds who have, captured the hospital system in Tembisa. How does the police, and this is how the lead cross-examiner, Advocate Hassam, opens this examination, is to ask him, how do you, with all this knowledge, this public knowledge about the character that is Kat Matlala, how do you still manage to have such a close and cozy relationship with him that you invite him to your son's wedding? And it's not just him, it's Beyicele, who Kat Matlala says demanded R1 million worth of bribes from him. Beyicele claims this is after he was the Minister of Police. It's another Deputy National Commissioner, General Sintumule, who is the one who sold the country for a BBL, it seems, if those allegations are proven to be true. And I must say, a lot of these allegations are untested because of the nature of the commission. We also it has a plus and a negative to it, in the sense that we benefit from hearing testimony that is untested in court, right? But the downside of this is how much of this is actual evidence that one can be prosecuted on. I think that will frustrate us much later when it's time for the NPA to actually act on these allegations. And then Senzo Chunu, right, our former minister of police, who has been suspended, who it is alleged had Kat Matlala pay for ANC attendees to the Jan 8 statement 2 years ago, had Kat Matlala fund those trips and the hotel trips and plane rides. But this is a person who is a big service provider, clearly, for the police, and has these close relationships and mutually financially beneficial relationships with the police, because obviously he's awarded the tenders and he gets to bribe his way, it appears. I'm alleging he gets to bribe his way through the police to retain those tenders through these relationships that he's established with all these the highest police we have in our country. It's disgraceful. It's absolutely disgraceful, and it's. I think people should definitely keep in mind that a lot of this evidence is just written testimony. There are images or screenshots of texts between General Sibia and the alleged girl between. General Sibia obviously denies every allegation that's put to him about his relationship. He doesn't even want us to use that word relationship to describe what he had with Kat Matlala. Claims that they've only met 5 times. His testimony is quite long, like I said, 90 pages, only 2 of those dedicated to this element of the story. So it's absolutely disgraceful, sort of police that we have staffed in our government, particularly in those high echelons. And if that's how the police looks at the top, what do we expect of detectives, of police stations?
One really wonders how SAPS, I think, is ever going to recover from this credibility blow. SAPS is already not a trusted institution, and it is. Well, I'm not hopeful that we're going to see major reforms. If we actually did have some sort of political shift in this country, and the Ramaphosa administration was replaced by one that was more interested in actually, I think, taking action, fixing SAPS, replacing SAPS. I don't even know what the right word to use is. Burning it to the ground and building it from the ashes must be a priority, because I think this really is the final nail on the coffin for the credibility of the police, which is a shame, because there are lots of South African police officers who every day risk their lives going out trying to keep a lid on criminality. But that's unfortunate. This is crisis level stuff, and it's only going to get worse in a sense. These kind of issues, it just sort of, it makes one's head spin when plastic surgery for big butts is apparently all it takes to get into the highest levels of power in this country. It's very depressing. Anyway, any more thoughts, Makone?
That's a very good word to end it on, that the country's going prices, BBLs, as it's alleged in this testimony by General Sibia.
Oh man, yeah, it's actually interesting how similar there are some sort of there's some aspects of this to the Gupta stuff, right? Which is that there also the price of so much of that corruption was not particularly high often. Mm-hmm. Just hideous stuff. Okay, let's move on to our last story. This one's a bit technical. And I'm sure it's one that also that people care about a lot, because it is involving taxes, specifically in this case, city rates. There's been a big discussion, I think, in Cape Town, particularly in the lead up to the next local government elections, about the significant increase in rates that's happened over the past couple of years, municipal rates for properties. The city of Cape Town does have a positive financial position, 68 billion rand in accumulated surplus and 13 billion rand in cash. The city says that it uses this surplus to maintain lower tariffs and limit increases by reducing the need to raise external loans, which would otherwise have a direct impact on tariff levels. There are many Cape Townians, however, who are complaining about various things to do with the cost of living in the city. Rates is one of them. Rent is another one, which has seen some calls for rent control to be issued from various quarters. That is an idea that the mayor himself has actually pushed back against in an op-ed, and I think is rent control is a terrible idea. But going back to the rates, average property rates component in some places has risen 170%. The Daily Maverick did an investigation where they found they looked at a number of individual properties whose details, bills and stuff were sent into them over the course of 10 years. They compared the 2016 valuations with the 2026 valuations. They found that in the sample, 170% increase in rates, but only 131% increase in property value. The city, for its part, disputes some of the findings of this article, saying that, well, over the last 10 years, we've actually changed the way we calculate things. We've taken some fees out of electricity and water tariffs, which were not included in this analysis, and placed them in other things. So they say that it's not fair to compare them across the years. But I think the general point for me, Makone, is that Cape Town is suffering from a problem of is getting pretty expensive for a lot of people to live there, and um, part of that is because it is in many ways South Africa's only successful working city, and part of that is just because South Africa, despite the Cape generally being better off, is just not having great economic growth. And if you don't have growth, but you have more people, you don't have enough money in the system as a whole. One of the complaints, of course, is that the city spends too much money on its poorer residents in the sense that it gives them free services, or it spends too much on infrastructure development for them while taxing its wealthy residents to pay for that. If you have a country where lots of people are unemployed, where only one city is functioning, where you don't have growth kind of allowing people to lift the boats, their own boats themselves, you really do run into a situation, I think, where you don't have any particularly good options left. And I do feel like the city of Cape Town might be getting to that point where, taxing people more is not really necessarily going to work, but it still needs money to provide various things. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this issue?
It's a toughie. I think the city is definitely a victim of its own success because it's outrunning South Africa at a very fast pace. And South Africa's middle class wages and income is not able to catch up to the speed at which the city is running. I did appreciate a lot of the responses from the city to this article. But there are some considerations that it will need to take if the DA is to retain Cape Town, because I fear um, political opponents and alternative political parties only have to promise better rates for some people to consider voting for them and to ditching the DA in that city. Um, but I think there are some wise people who will see through that. Um, there's also the like one of the things I think that you should consider is the way that it calculates rates. I mean, if it's based on property values rather than consumption, then you're always going to have that disparity where you're receiving a bill for services that you're receiving such a high bill, and there's no way you could have raked up that bill yourself. And I think that's a lot of where the contention in this article seems to be emerging
Yeah, I
from.
mean, the key example is like you're a pensioner, right? So you have a fixed
Mm,
income, you've got your
yes.
investments, your pension, whatever, and your property value is now like 4 or 5 times, let's say, which in Cape Town is not unusual. The property
Mm,
market here has gone absolutely bonkers in the past few years. Uh, but you're not selling your house, so while yes, it's an asset on the books, you're not like getting more from that. But your rates have gone up to sort of match this, and that is a real problem for people that causes them very serious issues. And particularly when you're old, you don't want to move, even if that is the financial decision. And people resent like having to move from a house that maybe you've lived in for a long time, or it's like a family house or whatever, just simply because your area has gotten better.
yeah, and because of the decline everywhere else, you're just seeing Cape Town take up a new place in South Africa where everybody now wants to move there, whereas that wasn't the case, especially not at this rate. And one of the responses I appreciated from the city was to actually compare the rate at which rates have grown in Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni versus in Cape Town. And it does show that rate growth in Cape Town has been faster than the other cities at 4 to 5 times more. But how does Joburg justify its 2 to 3 times rates growth when everything has just been on the decline there? There's no way to justify the rates increases in Johannesburg when people's if rates are calculated based on property values, you should actually have less rates, right? Because your property value's gone down rather than increased. So I do think that it is suffering from its own success. And I worry about people from Cape Town also not being able to afford living in their city. I think that's definitely a travesty. And it's also just one of those things that is so new in South Africa, where maybe people who come from world famous cities like New York have been experiencing those sort of things. But I think this is a fairly new conversation in South Africa where
Hmm.
if you were born and raised in Cape Town, you suddenly can't afford to live there. I don't think that that's ever really been the case for people generally in South Africa to not be able to afford to live in their home cities.
This is a rare story in which it's my fault because, of course, I'm a recent immigrant from Gauteng to Cape Town. I'm part of the reason why property values are going up. Not that I own property, but people like me moving to the city, middle class people in particular, have been pushing up property prices and these sort of things. And the city has grown enormously, which causes some of these issues. Now, sometimes the answer is like people just have to move, and that's irritating and annoying, and it can be heartbreaking for some people, but it is the only thing that sort of makes economic sense. But I think for me, you can look at this and you can say the city shouldn't be charging this, or it shouldn't be spending money on this or all that. And I think those are all fair to debate about. But when I step back and I look at this in the bigger picture, there are two really big problems. One is, as I said, we just don't have enough growth, enough money, enough wealthy people in this country. We need to be creating more wealthy people in this country. And that's something that we don't do. We create sort of wealthy, connected elites, but we don't create sort of people who are like bringing new money into the system. Those are people, a lot of those wealthy elites are just living off of tax money. We're not creating a middle class, essentially, that pays taxes, that can afford to build houses, that, really is growing the backbone of our economy. Things like unemployment, of course, one of the biggest contributors to that fact. But also, we can't only have one major city in the country that is sort of functioning, that people want to move to. And this is why it's actually imperative that we see improvements in municipal governance in our other big cities, in Pretoria, in Joburg, in eThekwini, Durban, in Bloemfontein, in PE, Kapega, because otherwise, Cape Town is just going to become this sort of weird island that kind of people are trying to get into, but they're priced out of it, so it sprawls, so it causes more problems. I think there are sort of limits to a certain degree to which municipal governments might run up against in trying to solve some of the bigger problems if the country is still headed in the economic direction. I don't know, Makone, those are just sort of my initial thoughts. What's your take on that?
I'm thinking of a Cape Townian watching this, and I think for them, it's more than an economic issue. I mean, it is definitely the case of a country that's not growing and a city that's outpacing everybody else, like I've said. And I'm just not sure what the solution is for that, because you really can't help immigration. It's going to happen. People moving for better economic opportunities, better livelihoods, which Cape Town certainly offers. But yeah, this is definitely a challenge to the other cities to get their act together. And for residents in those cities, Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Pretoria, we're looking at you to be careful who you elect in the next elections. And Cape Town is definitely an example of what those cities can rise to, of the levels that those cities can rise to, and the potential for those cities. Because if people are moving by the droves to Cape Town because there's no pothole inside, streetlights work, services are provided, then the likelihood of them doing the same, if the other cities get their act together, is quite high. We already have the evidence of it in this case. So it's likely that it'll be the same if Johannesburg gets to working.
Indeed. And that's why I think that old adage that Joburg's success is South Africa's success is actually probably more true than ever. And in a sense, I think Cape Town is really feeling that as well. But anyway, I'm sure people have thoughts on this one, because it is, very contentious when your rates go up like this, particularly when you don't necessarily see stuff improving around you or seeing things kind of stay roughly the same. Taxes are never popular and are rarely a good thing. They are a necessary evil, not a good in of themselves. So yeah, no, I think this story is certainly not going away, and I think it is going to be a part of the discussion in the next few months going forward. Okay, with that, let's call it to a close. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you found the show interesting. We will be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone. Have a great day. The Daily Friend Show and the Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR, or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.